Fantastic globes line the Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv. 150 artists each have created their own version of our planet. Spectators can choose where they would like to live. A playful way of dealing with a topic that, in Israel, holds a particular meaning. Liat, Haggai and Ariel Dreilinger represent the young Jewish state's third generation. Having a homeland is something their family does not take for granted.
People that know their family history know better themselves.
The Dreilingers' family history begins with them, grandparents Tony and Joseph. One of their favorite places is the viewing platform Yad Lebanim overlooking Ramat Gan. Every year in the Square of the Good News, people gather to remember the victims of the Holocaust. Keeping the memory alive, especially within their own family, remains important to both of them.
My children started asking about my number. What does it mean? They asked all the time, from the age of 3. Why does he have a grandmother and I don't? And so I had to tell them. Slowly, bit by bit, I told them everything. Today they all know, all of our children, even the grandchildren know, everything we went through during the Holocaust. And by now they're grown up. The youngest is 21 years old.
I will tell you, I recently went for the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. It was my first time visiting the site of the former concentration camp and also the site of the displaced persons camp. And I went with very mixed emotions because on the one hand, this is the site of terrible devastation and tragedy, yet at the same time, it's the site of the rebirth of my own family and of many hundreds of Jewish families.
Jody and her grandparents live in New York. For Lily and Sam Bloch, it has been a long journey to their home in America. Sitting in a sidewalk cafe in Greenwich with their granddaughter, they are reminded of their own youth, of the desire for a home, for safety, for shelter. The couple's story has also influenced the second and third generation of the Bloch family. Here too, the past has been discussed frequently and openly. April 15th, 1945. The British military reaches the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, northeast of Hanover. At the entrance, cheering prisoners welcome the soldiers. But the liberators' first impression of the camp is woefully misleading. Emaciated by hunger and thirst, tormented by typhoid fever and tuberculosis, people are withering away, inside and outside the huts. Altogether, 60,000, corralled in a camp designed to hold 3,000 prisoners. Without food, water and medicine, most of them are just waiting to die.
The girls came in and said, "The British have arrived, we're free." And I cried like I'd never cried before. God, I had wanted so much to survive, to live. But for what? I had no mother, no father, no siblings, no uncles or aunt, nobody left. What did I stay alive for? What would I do now? Where would I go?
Toni Good was 15 when her parents, her younger sister, and her beloved grandmother were shot in her Ukrainian hometown in 1942. Both of her brothers fled east. Assuming a fake identity, she survived for 2 years as a farmhand in Poland, but a betrayal then landed her in Auschwitz. From there, she was deported to Bergen-Belsen in the fall of '44. As many of her fellow sufferers, she contracted typhoid and was slowly succumbing to a high fever. At the time the camp was liberated, she weighed merely 70 pounds. Her first cautious steps outside the hut were gruesome.
When I first stepped out in front of the block, there was a huge pile of corpses. I didn't know anything about all that. I had seen them carrying out bodies every day, but I didn't know it was that many. The pile was higher than the prisoners' huts. There had been nobody there to bury them. It was a shock. It was terrible, terrible.
My task was burying the dead. They had covered them with chalk and piled them up in the shower rooms, thousands of them. And then in pairs of 2, we had to take a corpse from the pile and carry it to the ditch. And if you weren't careful there, and you fell into the ditch, there was no way of getting out again. I had to do this for 8 days, until the liberation.
Joseph Dreilinger was his parents' 5th child, born in 1926 in the Harz mountain town of Nordhausen. With the onset of the Third Reich, his Polish parents fled to Katowice. During the war, his family was dispersed through deportation and arrest. As a forced laborer, Joseph survived various camps, reaching Bergen-Belsen shortly before its liberation. The British relieved him of his grueling task of carrying corpses. Instead, SS and camp guard units were forced to dig the mass graves. The Allies counted more than 10,000 unburied corpses on the premise, lying everywhere, even amongst the living. These horrible images went around the world, becoming emblematic of the atrociously inhumane Nazi regime. The catastrophic conditions required a swift response. Within days, the British restored the water supply. They provided sanitary facilities for those who were physically able to use them. And above all, food for tens of thousands starved and desperately waiting for a warm meal.
Many died after the liberation. Everybody was starving, so they started eating too much of the rich meat and fatty soups they were given. That was fatal. But they didn't know any better. Many died, and all they wanted was to live.
Despite all the measures, almost 14,000 people died in the aftermath of the liberation. The harsh conditions of the concentration camp still taking their toll. Prisoners' huts were turned into sick bays. Nearby former German army barracks turned into an emergency ward. Those fit for transport were brought to hospitals in the area. A disinfection campaign was aimed at stopping parasites and epidemics. Those with homes and families in the West were free to go. With a clean bill of health, they happily left the camp. Those who came from the East could not leave. The war was still raging on there. Those left behind tried to make do. The contaminated, verminous blankets and clothes were incinerated. In their struggle against typhoid fever, the British were finally forced to burn down all of the wooden huts of the former concentration camp Bergen-Belsen. 1 month after liberation, as the last barrack went up in flames, the liberators and survivors watched together and celebrated the symbolic fiery act.
The burning down of the last hut was one final symbol of the victory over the Nazi regime.
For the survivors, the significance was huge. The walls that had kept them were destroyed, giving way for a new beginning. Their new life began directly next to the old concentration camp grounds in the former Wehrmacht camp Hohne. About 27,000 survivors of Bergen-Belsen were relocated there, so-called DPs, displaced persons. The aim was to create a temporary transit camp. Little did most of them know, it would become their home for years to come.
Back then, it was our salvation. We had no alternative. I couldn't go back to Poland. I had no family left there, no one. And so this was the only solution for us.
With the help of international aid organizations, the British quickly managed to supply the camp inhabitants with all necessary goods. Far more challenging, however, proved the task of lifting their spirits, to fight their gloomy apathy caused by years of imprisonment, abuse, disease, and persecution. Slowly, the British tried to establish a community.
The British went around asking, who's able to work, to help out in the kitchen, for example, peeling potatoes or what have you. And I raised my hand. They delivered tons of meat, bread, butter. My task was taking care of the meat. I had to chop it up, distribute it, and boil it in a cauldron with the potatoes. I wasn't doing it all alone, but I cooked it. There were 700 people to feed.
The first weeks of his new life, Joseph Dreilinger spent in the canteen kitchen, seeing little else of the new camp. But one building piqued his curiosity: the impressive roundhouse. It was formerly a ballroom for SS officers' festivities, dubbed the Himmler Palace. This ballroom, where Nazis once wined and dined under spectacular chandeliers, was now providing shelter to their victims.
Man hat eingerichtet in Rundhaus Betten in großen Zimmern, Ballsaal haben.
They put the beds into the roundhouse. About 102 beds in the ballroom, 37 in the adjacent one. Those suffering from tuberculosis stayed in the former solarium. And they actually set up a temporary hospital, where I helped out distributing medication, making up the beds, talking to patients and comforting them. I had no one left, nowhere to go. So what choice did I have but to help my friends get better?
She worked there as a nurse, and I was there simply to check out the facility. I bumped into her, and we soon discovered that she came from the same region in Poland as my parents. And that was a surprise, as there was nobody else in the camp from that region. So we immediately established a special